1 minute ago. Diddy breaks up charges in explosive courtroom moment. This is a setup. Before the cameras rolled and the nation turned its eyes to a federal courtroom already brimming with tension, no one could have predicted the moment that was about to unfold. Not even the journalists, some of them seasoned cynical and used to scandal, saw it coming. But when Oprah Winfrey walked through the side door of the courtroom on day 7 of the trial of Sean Diddy Combs, a silence unlike any courtroom silence settled. Not hesitation, not confusion, reverence. Because she didn't just arrive, she intervened. No leaks, no subpoenas, no pre-announced witness list, just the unmistakable presence of the most influential woman in modern American television, stepping up to defend a man many had already condemned. And, in doing so, Oprah Winfrey flipped the energy of the courtroom and the nation's understanding of the trial upside down. She didn't make a show of it. Dressed in a gray tailored suit, spectacles lowered on her nose, she moved like a scholar more than a savior. Calm. Intentional. As she took the stand, not a single word had yet left her mouth, and already every legal pad in the room had been flipped open, every sketch artist's pencil freshly sharpened. The air was dense with a single expectation that she might just say something no one could unhear. "I'm here today," she began, "because I cannot sit quietly while a man I've known for over 20 years is being portrayed as something I do not recognize." That line didn't just break the silence, it shattered the courtroom's posture. The judge shifted in his seat. The lead prosecutor pressed his pen hard against his notebook, the ink pooling at the edge. Diddy himself, jaw clenched, lifted his eyes and mouthed words to his attorney that were too quiet to be picked up by anyone else. But his face said it all: disbelief, gratitude, maybe even fear, because when Oprah speaks, people listen. And this time she wasn't hosting a segment. She was altering the course of federal proceedings. Over the next 45 minutes, Oprah did what the defense had failed to do. In 6 full days, she rehumanized the accused. Not with hyperbole or platitudes, but with specifics. She referenced a 1999 charity event in Chicago where she first met Diddy. She recalled late-night calls about youth mentorship financial support given anonymously to struggling artists, and moments of humility that contradicted the public image of excess. Then, with clinical calm, she looked the jury in the eye and delivered her first emotional incision. "If you believe every word being said about him right now," she said, "then you must believe I have been blind for 20 years. And I assure you, I have not." The prosecution moved to object. The judge raised a hand. Overruled. Oprah acknowledged the gravity of the allegations, especially those involving Cassie Ventura. "I watched her grow up in this industry. I believe she's endured hardship. But I do not believe Sean Combs is guilty of the crimes laid at his feet." Her words were chosen with surgical precision, not to discredit pain, but to separate pain from prosecution. And the effect was immediate. One juror, seated center left, tapped his pen twice against his notepad. Another glanced toward the public gallery, where phones, though forbidden, buzzed under jackets and handbags. Then came the binder. She opened it slowly, like a priest unsealing confession. Page after page, she read names, dates, events. She challenged the prosecution's timeline on a now notorious Las Vegas suite incident from 2010, asserting her own presence there, albeit not at the club, but at the post-event gathering. There was chaos, she admitted. Celebration, noise, but not coercion, not crime. She recalled conversations, phone calls, moments that painted a far more nuanced picture than the headline suggested. "I asked Cassie plainly in 2015 if she felt unsafe," Oprah read from a handwritten note. Her words, "I feel boxed in, but that's how it is in this industry." That phrase, the jury was told, had never been published before. It was private. Now it was precedent. The prosecution tried again to intervene, this time citing hearsay. But again, the judge allowed the testimony, noting Oprah was establishing context to the accuser's state of mind. And then, in what became the most viral moment, within minutes of the court recessing, Oprah lifted a screenshot. A blog headline in black and red: Diddy's secret tunnel of victims. This, Oprah said, received over 1.4 million clicks, based on a Reddit thread started by an anonymous user with no verified identity. And this, she held up another paper, is the trial you expect to be immune from cultural contamination. No one answered. She wasn't finished. I have walked with survivors, she continued. I have held their hands, aired their stories, heard their screams. I know trauma. I recognize truth. And I also recognize when momentum replaces evidence. Diddy looked downward. The prosecution whispered furiously. The defense sat silent, knowing nothing they could say would match what had just been spoken. And yet, Oprah didn't pivot toward glorifying the man. She made it clear he is complex. He is flawed. But I do not believe he is a predator. I believe he is a target. The distinction echoed. Target. Not monster. Not martyr. Just a man caught in a storm, one she argued had been whipped into chaos by a media machine hungry for spectacle. Her closing statement for part 1 came not as a defense, but as a diagnosis. We are building a monster in real time, she said. And once a man is called a monster, it becomes nearly impossible to see him as anything else. The room froze, and with that, the first half of her testimony ended. Not with a mic drop, but with a shift. You could feel it in the air. Not acquittal, not absolution, just uncertainty. And in a courtroom, this public uncertainty is power. And in a courtroom where narratives had hardened like concrete over the course of 6 days, that sudden emergence of uncertainty, cracked open not by evidence but by presence, was the most dangerous thing of all. Oprah didn't step down from the stand immediately. The judge called a short recess, and during that interlude, the energy didn't dissipate, it charged. Reporters outside fumbled with microphones. Editors scrambled to rewrite midday headlines. Inside, no one moved from their seat. Even the bailiff, typically the least moved by courtroom spectacle, remained statue still beside the jury box. When court resumed, it wasn't the defense or the prosecution who took command. It was Oprah, again binder still in hand. This time, she opened to a different Section 1 that addressed not just Diddy's history, but the architecture of modern scandal. I have spent decades, she said calmly in front of cameras. I know what it means to have your name turned into shorthand for shame. I know how fast a narrative can eclipse the truth. And I know what it means when the public begins to consume allegations as entertainment. She turned the binder toward the jury, clipped inside printed screenshots of tweets, TikToks, and YouTube thumbnails, some with millions of views. Phrases like Diddy the Predator, cancel, Combs billionaire, Bunker King leapt off the page like verdicts rendered not by judges, but by trending tabs. Tell me, Oprah said quietly, how do you expect a jury to separate what they know from what they've seen? The silence that followed was not rhetorical. It was instructional. She wasn't asking for an answer. She was asking for accountability. The prosecution again objected. Irrelevant, they argued. Oprah's response was clinical. Your case isn't being tried in this courtroom alone. It's being tried in every phone, every tweet, every whisper passed through digital filters before the jury ever took their oath. You're fighting for a verdict in here, while a sentence has already been carried out there. And then came the turn, the moment where testimony became something else entirely. I'd like to share something that has not been made public until now, Oprah said. The room leaned forward collectively. In 2015, Cassie Ventura and I had dinner in Los Angeles. Just the two of us. No agents, no lawyers, no cameras. She was at a crossroads emotionally, professionally, and she told me something I've never forgotten. Oprah paused. She didn't look down at her notes. She looked directly at the jury. She said, "I don't feel afraid. I just feel forgotten." The sentence was a scalpel. It didn't cut loudly, but it cut cleanly. The prosecution objected again. Hearsay. Oprah remained composed. The defense has referenced multiple private conversations. In this case, I'm offering one. And I'm not here to erase Cassie's truth. I'm here to offer the truth I lived. The judge allowed her to proceed. She spoke of Cassie's words not as an attempt to discredit her, but to provide what Oprah called the context we refuse to examine when we're angry. According to Oprah, Cassie had never in any private conversation referred to physical abuse, violence, or fear. She had described exhaustion, emotional stagnation, the feeling of being trapped in a career mold she didn't craft. And yes, she had expressed frustration with Diddy, but not fear of him. Then Oprah shifted again, this time to the tunnel allegations. I've heard the stories, the basements, the cages, the alleged secret passages beneath his homes, she said. I've been to those homes. There are wine cellars, yes. Security rooms. But there are no tunnels. No labyrinths. No horror beneath the floorboards. This is not a Netflix documentary. This is a real man's life. A murmur ran through the gallery. She held up a printout again from a blog. 1.4 million views. Originated from a Reddit thread by a self-proclaimed former intern. No verification. No corroboration. But it didn't matter. The story stuck. And then with surgical brutality, she said what no one in the courtroom dared say. We are in danger not just of false convictions, but of false rituals. We are performing justice as a spectacle. And spectacle does not serve survivors. It only serves algorithms. Her tone was not angry, it was mournful. And then she turned unexpectedly to address the elephant in the room, Monique. The day before, Monique's testimony had lit fire to every entertainment news cycle. She had accused Oprah, Diddy, and Tyler Perry of operating what she called a machine of silence, of lifting up predators while silencing truth. Oprah didn't avoid it. She walked straight into the storm. I heard Ms. Jackson's testimony. I have no doubt that she spoke her truth, Oprah said, but truth is not monolithic. It has edges, it has contradictions, and pain, while real, can distort. The judge raised an eyebrow but didn't intervene. She continued. I have never protected abuse. I have never shielded a predator, but I will not allow disagreement to be mistaken for complicity. And then calmly, she introduced documents into evidence emails and transcripts proving that several of the conversations Monique claimed happened in 2008 had in fact occurred in 2012 under very different circumstances. The prosecution objected. The judge overruled again, but Oprah wasn't trying to smear Monique. She made that clear. Her voice matters, her pain matters, but we must not turn unresolved conflict into prosecutorial narrative. The courtroom shifted again. The power dynamic was changing, not just between the parties involved, but between the courtroom and the outside world watching. Because Oprah wasn't just testifying. She was putting the justice system in its symbiotic relationship with public hunger on trial. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She wasn't even asking for belief. She was demanding the one thing the court had neglected since the first headline dropped clarity. And in doing so, she didn't clear Diddy's name. She challenged the legitimacy of the name he had been assigned, Monster. As she closed her binder, her voice softened not with fear, but finality. What I am seeing now is not justice. It is a witch hunt. Gasps, audible ones. Even a stifled exhale from one of the junior prosecutors. But Oprah didn't flinch. She had said what needed to be said. And now the courtroom had to decide not whether Diddy was innocent, but whether they were willing to admit that guilt once manufactured becomes nearly irreversible. She didn't sit down a celebrity. She sat down a reckoner. It was the word no one wanted to hear in a courtroom, least of all from Oprah Winfrey witch hunt. But she had said it without hesitation, without apology. and once said it couldn't be unsaid. It lingered thick in the air, not as a rhetorical flourish, but as an accusation in itself, aimed not at one person, but at the entire machine grinding in and around that courtroom. She didn't recant. She didn't soften. She leaned into the phrase, and then dared the jury, the press, and the prosecution to examine the foundation they were standing on. Because if this was about truth, it had to be truth in full, not selected excerpts that fit headlines, not emotional distortions bent into legal shape. The term makes people uncomfortable, she continued, now turning away from the prosecution and back to the jury. And it should. Because history teaches us that once you declare someone a monster, you stop asking questions. You stop checking facts. You start building bonfires. A long pause. No pen scratched. No cough broke the tension. Ask yourselves, when did you start believing he was guilty? Was it after you heard the evidence or before, when you saw the first headline, the first hashtag, the first meme? By now, Diddy was no longer just an accused man. He was a symbol of celebrity excess, of cultural fatigue, of everything the internet wanted to destroy, to feel morally alive. But Oprah wasn't there to cleanse him of guilt. She was there to remind the room that moral momentum is not the same as legal proof. She leaned slightly forward on the witness stand. Her voice didn't rise, but her cadence shifted, each word now weighted like a slow pendulum. I know what it means to have your name twisted, your motives questioned, your silence interpreted as complicity. I know what it feels like to be told that unless you join the outrage, you must be part of the cover-up. The room remained still. She then described a private phone call from 2021, months before this case broke publicly. Diddy had just pulled out of a major appearance after a tabloid ran a sensational, later debunked story about his alleged past. According to Oprah, he didn't sound angry. He sounded broken. He said to me, "I've made mistakes, but I'm not a monster." And I believed him, she said, because I've seen him when the cameras weren't rolling. And then came the sharpest turn yet, not away from the accusers, but toward the system itself. If you want to prosecute him for arrogance, for extravagance, for being a flawed man in a system that rewards ego, go ahead. But that's not what's happening here. What's happening here is the attempted destruction of a legacy. There it was. The argument that cut deeper than innocence or guilt, that Diddy was not just being judged for what he did, but for who he had become, too rich, too black, too visible, too easy to hate. And the backlash wasn't about justice. It was about ritual. We do not want due process. Oprah said we want a sacrifice. At that line, the courtroom didn't gasp. It contracted. Even the judge, long stoic and unreadable, shifted slightly. Not in disagreement, but in realization. He had likely felt it too. The trial was no longer just a proceeding. It was a performance. And no one in the cast had dared to walk off script until now. Diddy's attorneys sat still, their pens resting on closed notepads. They had stopped defending. Oprah was doing what none of them could, recentering the courtroom's compass, not toward exoneration, but toward complexity. And then she delivered what would become the most replayed moment of the day, if not the trial. She looked toward the jury, and her voice dropped just slightly. Not for drama, but for intimacy. You're not just deciding a case. You're deciding what kind of society we want to be. One where due process still matters, or one where headlines hand out life sentences. It wasn't a rhetorical device. It was a challenge. And for a moment, the jury didn't just look like observers. They looked like citizens. Then came her closing blow, not to the prosecution, not to Cassie, not even to the media, but to the cultural engine turning tragedy into trend. Oprah described how Diddy's story had been hijacked by a cycle she knew all too well. She referenced how quickly the press turned from celebration to condemnation. How the same media outlets that once praised him for redefining hip-hop and fashion had now committed themselves to burning the very legacy they helped build. They crowned him in the 2000s, she said. Now they're burning him in the 2020s. She read headlines aloud Diddy's cult predator in plain sight cancel combs. Then she held up a single tweet, one that had gone viral with over 300,000 likes. It read, "I always knew he was evil. Look at his eyes." Oprah looked directly at the jury again. That's not journalism, that's superstition. And for the first time, one of the jurors, an older woman in a blue blazer, visibly closed her notepad, not out of boredom, out of reckoning. Then Oprah pivoted again, not away from the pain, but into it. She addressed Cassie Ventura once more, not as an adversary, but as a mirror of the system's contradictions. I believe Cassie endured hardship. I believe she struggled to be seen beyond her relationship. But I also believe she never said she was afraid. Not until years later. Not until the headlines had already rewritten her past. It wasn't an attack. It was a call for precision. She referenced a phone call from 2019 after Cassie had announced her public split with Diddy. "She called me crying," Oprah said. She said, "I just want people to remember I'm more than his girlfriend." That line landed like a silent scream. She didn't say she was a prisoner. She said she was forgotten. And then carefully Oprah said what no one else dared. Sometimes pain evolves. Sometimes memory changes. That does not make it false, but it does not make it infallible. The prosecution didn't move to interrupt. By then, even they seemed uncertain whether an objection would do more harm than good. And so the room sat with it. A story far more complex than guilt or innocence. A narrative being reframed not to excuse, but to demand rigor. Because this trial wasn't about one man anymore. It was about whether truth could still survive in a world already convinced it no longer needed to listen. It was no longer a matter of testimony or evidence, but of willingness. Willingness to listen. Willingness to doubt the machinery of assumption. As Oprah's voice faded into that heavy courtroom quiet, the question she left behind wasn't about guilt, it was about belief. Who gets it? Who loses it? And what it costs to claim it back once it's gone. By now, the jury wasn't just hearing her. They were following her. Not blindly, but cautiously, with the kind of focus usually reserved for closing arguments, not mid-trial witness accounts. But Oprah wasn't just recounting events. She was excavating something deeper, a system of perception that had grown louder than fact. She took a breath and continued this time, not with documents or timelines, but with a reflection so personal it cut through the courtroom like a confession in a cathedral. "I have lived through many public storms," she said, voice low. "I've seen people turn on me based on stories that weren't even half true. But I survived because I had the tools, the access, the ability to speak for myself." She turned to the gallery. But what happens when someone doesn't? What happens when someone like Sean, who is already drowning in scandal, has no way to redirect the story? It becomes the truth. Not because it's right, but because it's loud. She paused, and the internet is deafening. That wasn't hyperbole. That was testimony to a cultural shift. One in which amplification had replaced examination, and trend had replaced trial. She then held up a single folded piece of paper. On it was printed a screen grab from a tabloid site with the headline, "Victims Found Under Diddy's Mansion. Bunker of Pain Theory Confirmed." That headline, she said quietly, was based entirely on a Reddit post. No source, no photo, no police report, and it received 1.4 million views in 36 hours. She looked back at the judge, who nodded slowly, deliberately. This isn't reporting. It's sentencing. The courtroom shifted again like a boat suddenly realizing it's drifting from shore. There was no anchor anymore, not in facts, not in headlines, not even in testimonies. Oprah was carving space for something both dangerous and vital nuance. She moved next to the question of legacy. Sean Combs is not a saint, she said. He's made mistakes. Some I've seen. Some I've challenged him on. But I do not believe he is a trafficker. I do not believe he is a monster hiding victims beneath his floorboards. And then her tone darkened not with volume, but with weight. Shame on anyone who sells that fiction to make a fortune off someone else's downfall. That line struck differently, not as a defense of Diddy, but as an indictment of an industry. An ecosystem that feeds on implosion packages, pain, and monetizes every scandal like a new product drop. And then she turned toward the previous day's landmine, Monique. I want to speak directly to Ms. Jackson Oprah, said using Monique's legal name. Because I watched her testimony. I felt her pain. I believe she meant every word she said. A moment passed. Some in the gallery braced for a counterattack. But truth is not a weapon. It's not a sword you swing at everyone who disagrees with you. I have never shielded abuse. I have never protected predators. I have simply refused to participate in public executions based on unresolved resentments. And then she admitted something rare for a courtroom vulnerability without spin. There was an interview I did in 2010, one she criticized. I included someone in it who caused her pain. That was my decision. I regret it. Not because it was unlawful, but because it hurt her. She didn't excuse it. She didn't reframe it. She owned it, but she also refused to let it be turned into ammunition in a federal case. This trial, she said, is not about old wounds. It is about criminal charges. And confusing personal betrayal with legal culpability is not justice. It's misdirection. At this point, even the defense team had stopped scribbling. They were listening too. And then she dropped what would become one of the most strategic revelations of the day. I have documentation emails, text transcripts from those years Monique referenced. Her timeline is inaccurate. Conversations, she says, happened in 2008, happened in 2012, under different circumstances, and I'm prepared to submit that to the court. The prosecution objected again. The judge allowed it, citing relevance due to Monique's prior testimony. It wasn't about tearing anyone down. It was about tightening the lens, refocusing, recalibrating. And that's when Oprah did something that felt almost theological. She stepped back from the content and spoke instead to the moment. This doesn't feel like justice, she said. It feels like retribution dressed up as due process. The room didn't breathe. Pain is real. But pain can also distort. When we start weaponizing trauma to settle scores, we don't honor survivors. We exploit them. She wasn't saying trauma should be doubted. She was saying it had to be examined with the same intensity as any other kind of evidence. And if it was left unchallenged simply because it came wrapped in emotion, then the court wasn't seeking justice. It was seeking compliance. Oprah then turned to the jury again. I'm not here to win a popularity contest. I know there are people who will say I've betrayed women, that I've enabled abuse, that I'm choosing friendship over truth. But that's not what this is. This is about choosing nuance over narrative. And then, just as the judge was preparing to call another break, Oprah added one final observation, quiet but piercing. This courtroom has stopped asking questions. It started writing scripts. And, if we're not careful, we will leave this trial not with a verdict, but with a myth. She stepped back, closed her binder. But she hadn't finished. She was preparing for her final chapter. The one that wouldn't just question the trial, or the media, or even the witnesses, but the soul of the system itself. She had closed her binder, but what lingered in the air was not the end of testimony. It was the question she'd planted in every mind in that courtroom. Are we on a path to justice, or are we rehearsing a myth we've already decided to believe? Oprah Winfrey stood not as a celebrity on a witness stand, but as a cultural litmus test. A living contradiction to the era of clickbait justice and algorithmic outrage. Her presence had already shifted the gravitational center of the room, but what came next would aim not just at the case, not even at the press, but at the very nature of truth in a society that seems to have grown tired of earning it. As the judge nodded for her to continue, she did so with a new tone, not defensive, not combative, reflective. She wasn't there to argue anymore. She was there to warn. "I didn't come here to protect a friend," she said. "I came here to protect a principle." The sentence landed like an oath. Every eye was on her. Even the court stenographer had subtly slowed their keystrokes trying to capture cadence as much as content. Oprah acknowledged the cost of her words. "I know what will be said. That I chose to defend a man over a movement. That I stood beside power rather than pain. That I betrayed something sacred." She paused, let the charge breathe. "But I reject that. I reject the idea that we must choose between accountability and accuracy, between listening and interrogating, between compassion and context." Then she looked directly at the jury eye's steady voice, quiet but deliberate. "You are not just deciding whether Sean Combs broke the law. You are deciding what kind of justice system we are willing to preserve in a world obsessed with instant judgment." She unfolded a small, handwritten note, something she had prepared herself. It wasn't typed. It wasn't rehearsed. It was what she called her reminder of why the rules matter. This system doesn't just judge people, she read. It consumes them. It devours their mistakes. It magnifies their sins. And it forgets their humanity. That wasn't hyperbole. It was diagnosis. The system had become not a filter for justice, but a furnace for story. "I'm not here to rewrite the rules," Oprah said. "I'm here to remind you that they exist." Her voice trembled, but not from weakness. From fatigue. The fatigue of having watched too many stories get flattened into archetypes. Too many people reduced to villains or martyrs with no room left in between. Diddy sat still, stone-faced hands locked. Not triumphant, not exonerated, just present. Oprah turned toward him only once. She didn't offer comfort. She didn't offer an apology. She offered something rarer acknowledgement. "I believe you are not the man they say you are," she said. "And I also believe you have to live differently if you survive this." That line hung with eerie weight. Not an endorsement, not an absolution. A demand? Because in Oprah's version of justice, accountability wasn't about punishment. It was about transformation. And then came her final pivot, the one that would send shockwaves through every newsroom, every think piece, every courtroom for years to come. She looked toward the gallery where artists sketched furiously and observers strained to hear every syllable, and she posed a final damning question. When did we stop believing that the truth takes time? It wasn't rhetorical. It was an indictment. We live in a culture where the loudest story wins, where the first viral clip becomes the definitive version of events. But justice, real justice, cannot be outsourced to a timeline. She described a culture that had become addicted to emotional payoff, that no longer made distinctions between accusation and conviction, between trauma and crime, between personal harm and legal liability. "We are collapsing categories," she said. "And when you collapse the categories, everything starts to feel true, even if it isn't." Then with terrifying calm, she revealed a final piece of information. 3 months before the trial began, she had hired a small research team to track every trending keyword related to Diddy. What they found was chilling. Over 70% of viral content naming him guilty was published before a single piece of sworn testimony was heard. She let the number hang there. No trial, no context, just content. That, she said, was the real danger. Not just that the public wanted answers, but that they wanted them faster than the system could possibly deliver. And if justice had once been about weighing the facts, It had now become a race to weaponize the first version that felt satisfying. "And that is how truth dies," she whispered. "Not with silence, with noise." Oprah stepped down from the stand. She didn't bow, didn't wave, didn't look for approval. Diddy stood not to embrace her, not to speak, but to acknowledge the moment with a single restrained nod. The gallery was still. The judge offered a courteous thank you, but even he seemed to recognize that what had happened in the last several hours was not ordinary testimony. It was a reckoning, a recalibration of the entire context in which this case, and maybe future cases, would be interpreted. Outside, the press was already rewriting the headlines. Not because Oprah had won anything, but because she had shifted the axis. The defense didn't even need to call another witness. They knew the room had changed. And inside, the jury sat quietly. No whispers, no eye contact. Just the hum of a realization still unfolding. They weren't just asked to judge a man. They were being asked to judge how a society defines guilt in the age of momentum. The case would continue. But the trial in its deepest form had already been transformed. Because in a world wired for cancellation, one woman had asked the only question that still mattered. What if we got it wrong? And no one, not even the prosecution, could answer her.